The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped through the rusted mail slot of apartment 2B like a paper guillotine. Autumn Morrison, 7 years old, with flour dust still clinging to her school uniform from helping at her mother's bakery, picked it up with both hands. The words stamped across the front in aggressive red ink didn't mean anything to her yet. Final notice. Eviction proceedings. 14 days. She carried it to the kitchen table where Rebecca sat hunched over a calculator surrounded by bills arranged in order of desperation. Electric company, water department, medical debt from her father's last hospital stay. The numbers never added up no matter how many times she ran them. Autumn held out the envelope. Rebecca's hand froze mid-calculation. She knew that particular shade of red, had been dreading it for 3 months while juggling double shifts and praying the landlord's patience would stretch just a little further. The letter confirmed what the knot in her stomach already knew. 14 days. Then the sheriff would come and everything she'd managed to hold together since Kenneth Whitmore walked out of their marriage 4 years ago would finally collapse. Autumn climbed onto the chair beside her, swinging her legs. Her voice carried the lightness of someone too young to understand the weight of paper and ink and consequences. "What's eviction mean, Mommy?" Rebecca folded the notice carefully, as if creasing it properly might make it less real. She reached for her daughter's hand, feeling the smallness of those fingers, the trust contained in that simple touch. "It means we might need to find a new place to live, baby." "Can we get one with a backyard? Sarah at school has a swing set." The question landed like a stone in deep water. Rebecca managed something that wasn't quite a smile, pulling Autumn close enough to smell the cheap shampoo in her hair, the scent of cinnamon from the bakery, mixing with little girl sweat. Maybe someday. Outside the window, the city groaned through another February afternoon. 4 years since the divorce. 4 years of scraping by on bakery wages while Kenneth built his empire higher, married younger, forgot he'd ever made promises about forever. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed at 23 too, in love, to imagine needing protection, had made certain she walked away with almost nothing. And when he discovered she was pregnant 3 months after filing his lawyers, made equally certain he'd never be legally tied to the result. Autumn existed in a legal gray space acknowledged by neither Kenneth's will or his conscience. That night, Rebecca lay awake on the pull-out couch, Autumn curled against her, in the space that served as both bedroom and living room. The eviction notice sat on the counter like a ticking clock. 14 days. She'd survived worse. The divorce had felt like drowning. The first year alone with an infant working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, that had been its own kind of hell. She'd learned to measure survival in small victories. Fed, clothed, loved. Those were the metrics that mattered, but the notice meant those metrics were failing. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sound of sirens and the neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls and the endless calculation of numbers that refused to balance. Morning arrived with brutal punctuality. Rebecca showered in water that barely reached lukewarm-dressed Autumn, in clothes that were clean, if not new, and took the first bus toward downtown. She'd asked Melissa Hartwell to cover her morning shift at Sunshine Bakery. Melissa had agreed without questions, the kind of favor that only another single mother understood. The pawn shop occupied a corner lot between a check-cashing place and a shuttered laundromat. Its windows were barred, its door reinforced. Rebecca had walked past it 100 times always, telling herself things weren't that desperate yet. Things were that desperate now. Inside, fluorescent lights, hummed over glass cases, displaying watches, cameras, guitars, wedding rings from other people's collapsed promises. The owner, a man with reading glasses on a chain and forearms covered in faded tattoos, barely looked up when she entered. Rebecca placed her last piece of jewelry on the counter. The engagement ring Kenneth had given her 20 years ago, back when he was still building his first development, and she was the receptionist who believed in his vision. The diamond was small, modest by the standards he'd later adopt, but real. The owner produced a jeweler's loupe, examining the stone with professional disinterest. When he finally named a price, Rebecca felt something inside her crack. $180. Her rent was $850. The eviction notice gave her 14 days. $180 bought her nothing except the temporary illusion of trying. She stood there, the ring between them, a circle of gold that had once meant forever. Her throat tightened. Autumn was waiting 3 blocks away at the public library, doing homework at a corner table, trusting her mother would return with some solution that made sense. "I need to think about it." She took the ring back, felt its weight in her palm. The owner shrugged already, forgetting her before she reached the door. Outside, Rebecca leaned against the brick wall and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of her situation. Then she straightened, dropped the ring into her coat pocket, and walked toward the library where her daughter waited. Autumn looked up when she entered, her face brightening with the kind of hope that made lying feel like protection. "Did you get the money, Mommy?" "Not yet, baby, but we'll figure something out. We always do." The next day was Autumn's 7th birthday. Rebecca had promised a celebration, the kind of promise made before eviction notices and impossible arithmetic. She'd planned to bake a cake at the bakery after her shift, something with pink frosting and sprinkles that would make Autumn shriek with 7-year-old joy. Instead, she worked a double shift and came home at 9 p.m. with a single cupcake from the day-old rack, the kind they sold at discount because the frosting had cracked. She'd stuck a birthday candle in the center, carried it home on the bus like a talisman against failure. Autumn sat cross-legged on the pull-out couch in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed bear Melissa had dropped off earlier. The apartment was dark, except for the kitchen light casting shadows that made the small space feel even smaller. Rebecca brought out the cupcake, the candle already lit. She sang "Happy Birthday" in a voice that threatened to break, watching Autumn's face glow in the flickering light. "Make a wish, baby." Autumn closed her eyes tight, her lips moving in silent prayer to whatever gods 7-year-olds believed in. Then she blew the flame guttering out in one breath. "What did you wish for?" Autumn looked up, her eyes holding something that made Rebecca's chest ache. "I wish Daddy would come back, then we could have money for a real cake." Rebecca pulled her daughter close, burying her face in Autumn's hair so she wouldn't see the tears. Kenneth Whitmore hadn't seen his daughter since she was 3 months old. He'd sent exactly 1 child support payment. Then his lawyers had found some loophole in the prenuptial agreement that made even that optional. He'd moved on to younger women, bigger deals, a life that had no room for the mistakes of his past. "You know what, baby? We don't need Daddy. We've got each other, and that's better than all the cake in the world." Autumn pulled back, studying her mother's face with the solemn intensity of children who learned too early that adults didn't always tell the truth. "Then why are you crying?" "Because I'm happy. These are happy tears." They split the cupcake, sitting on the couch in the near dark, and Rebecca tried to remember when she'd stopped believing her own lies. Friday morning arrived with the phone call that changed everything. Rebecca was measuring flour for the morning bread when her cell phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Unknown number, local area code. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another creditor who'd found her number. Something made her press accept. The voice on the other end was professionally neutral, the kind of tone that delivered news without inflection or emotion. Mrs. Morrison, this is Jonathan Pierce from Pierce & Associates. I'm calling regarding Kenneth Whitmore. Rebecca's hand tightened on the phone. She hadn't heard Kenneth's name spoken aloud in months, had trained herself to stop flinching when she saw his company's logo on billboards around the city. I'm not Mrs. Whitmore anymore. Haven't been for 4 years. My apologies, Miss Morrison. I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Whitmore passed away 3 days ago. Heart attack on the golf course. He was 62. The flour scoop slipped from Rebecca's other hand, white powder dusting the stainless steel counter. Around her, the bakery continued its morning rhythm. Melissa was pulling bread from the ovens, the delivery driver was stacking boxes, the espresso machine hissed and gurgled. Everything normal while the floor tilted beneath her feet. Dead. Kenneth Whitmore was dead. She felt a rush of emotion so tangled she couldn't separate them. Relief, anger, something that might have been grief for the man he'd been before money twisted him into someone unrecognizable. And underneath it all, a dark curiosity about why his lawyer was calling her. Why are you telling me this? Because your name appears in Mr. Whitmore's will. I am requesting your presence at the reading Monday morning at 10, my office downtown. I don't want anything from him. Jonathan Pierce's voice remained carefully neutral. Nevertheless, Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions. I'm required to inform all named parties. Will you be attending? Rebecca thought about the eviction notice. 14 days, now 11. She thought about Autumn asking if Daddy was coming back. She thought about the engagement ring still sitting in her coat pocket, unsold and worthless except for what it could buy at a pawn shop. I'll be there. She hung up before he could say anything else. Melissa appeared at her elbow, concern creasing her forehead. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Close enough. Kenneth died, heart attack. Melissa's expression shifted through several emotions before landing on grim satisfaction. Good. World's better off without men like him. Rebecca wanted to agree, wanted to feel that simple clarity. Instead, she felt the complicated weight of 20 years compressed into a phone call. She'd loved him once, built a life with him, believed his promises, signed papers she didn't understand because trust felt more important than protection. And he'd repaid that faith by erasing her from his life the moment she became inconvenient. Now he was dead, and somehow that erasure felt more complete than any divorce decree. His lawyer wants me at the will reading, Monday morning. Melissa's eyes narrowed. You think he left you something? Kenneth, no. He spent 4 years making sure I got nothing. This is probably just legal formality. But even as she said it, Rebecca felt the familiar hook of curiosity pulling at her. Why include her at all? Kenneth had been meticulous about cutting her out of his life. Every door sealed, every bridge burned. Showing up at the will reading meant facing that rejection one final time, watching him distribute his empire to everyone except the woman who'd stood beside him when it was just a dream sketched on napkins. Still, she'd survived worse humiliations, and somewhere beneath the scar tissue she needed to see it through. needed the closure of watching Kenneth's last act of dismissal so she could finally stop hoping he might remember he had a daughter. "Can you watch Autumn Monday morning? I won't be long." Melissa nodded. "Of course. And Rebecca, whatever happens in that office, you remember something. You survived him. That's the only victory that matters." The weekend passed in a blur of routine and dread. Rebecca worked her shifts, came home to Autumn, avoided thinking about Monday. Saturday night, she laid out her only suit, a navy blue relic from her marriage that had hung in the closet for 4 years untouched. The fabric smelled like mothballs and memory. Sunday, she visited her father at the state facility where he lived on Medicaid and medication. Edward Morrison's Parkinson's had progressed to the point where some days he barely recognized her, but today his eyes were clear when she walked into the common room. "You look troubled, daughter." Rebecca sat beside his wheelchair, taking his trembling hand. "Kenneth died. Heart attack." Edward's expression remained steady, years of disappointment having burned away any surprise. "I never trusted that man. Too hungry. Men that hungry always eat the people closest to them. His lawyer called, wants me at the will reading tomorrow." "You think he left you something?" Rebecca watched the other residents moving through their afternoon people, whose lives had narrowed to small rooms and television schedules, and the slow wait for whatever came next. Her father deserved better, deserved the kind of care that required money she'd never have. "No, but I need to see it through." Edward squeezed her hand with what strength remained. "Then go. Face it, and remember you're worth more than anything he could have left you anyway." Monday morning began with Autumn's questions. Rebecca knelt in front of her daughter, straightening the collar of her school uniform. "I have to go to a meeting this morning. You'll stay with Miss Melissa until I'm done, okay?" Autumn's eyes went wide. "Is it about Daddy?" Rebecca hesitated, weighing truth against protection. "His lawyer wants to talk to me, that's all." "Is Daddy coming to see me now?" The question hit harder than Rebecca expected. She pulled Autumn close, feeling the rapid butterfly beat of her daughter's heart. "No, baby. Daddy died last week. He's not coming back." Autumn processed this with the strange resilience of children, her face cycling through confusion and something that might have been relief. "Is that the daddy who doesn't visit me? Yes? Oh, okay." She squirmed free and picked up her backpack, apparently satisfied. Rebecca envied that simplicity, the ability to let go of what was never really there. The bus ride downtown took 90 minutes and 2 transfers. Rebecca sat near the back, her suit jacket pulled tight against the morning cold, watching the city transform from her neighborhood's worn apartments to the glass towers of the financial district. Autumn sat beside her, humming under her breath, swinging her legs in unconscious rhythm. Have you ever watched someone you loved choose money over you and then wondered if they ever regretted it? The question formed in Rebecca's mind without permission, a hook snagging on old wounds. She'd spent 4 years telling herself Kenneth's choices had nothing to do with her worth. But riding this bus, in a suit that no longer fit quite right, heading toward an office where she'd be reminded once more that she'd been found lacking the old doubts, circled like sharks. At the transfer point, Rebecca walked Autumn to Melissa's apartment, 3 blocks from the bakery. Melissa met them at the door already, in her work clothes, ready to take Autumn to school before her own shift started. "You got this," Melissa said, reading Rebecca's face with the fluency of friendship. "Whatever happens in there, You remember who you are." Rebecca nodded, unable to trust her voice. Autumn hugged her tight, then skipped inside without looking back. Children were merciful that way, Rebecca thought. They lived in the moment, unburdened by the weight of everything that came before. The second bus delivered her to the financial district with 15 minutes to spare. Pierce and Associates occupied the 40th floor of a steel and glass monument to corporate success. Rebecca rode the elevator in silence, watching the numbers climb, feeling the pressure build in her ears and chest. The reception area was all leather and chrome, designed to intimidate. Rebecca gave her name to the receptionist, who directed her to a conference room at the end of a hall lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Rebecca's yearly salary. Inside the conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city stretched out like a kingdom. Rebecca had forgotten this part of Kenneth's world, the way wealth bought altitude, bought distance from the streets where normal people struggled. She wasn't alone. Kimberly Ashford sat on a leather sofa near the windows, dressed in black, that managed to look more cocktail party than funeral. Her designer handbag probably cost more than Rebecca's rent. Her shoes definitely did. She held a tissue in manicured fingers, dabbing at eyes that showed no trace of actual tears. When Rebecca entered, Kimberly looked up. Her expression shifted from bored annoyance to cold assessment in half a second. "Oh, you're the first wife." Rebecca took a chair across the room, maintaining maximum distance. "Ex-wife. Right. Kenneth mentioned you once or twice, said you didn't understand what it took to build an empire." The words landed precisely where they were meant to, finding the old bruises and pressing hard. Rebecca forced her expression to remain neutral, refusing to give Kimberly the satisfaction of a reaction. Before either woman could speak again, the door opened and a third person entered. Richard Brennan, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit, nodded curtly to both women before taking a seat. Rebecca recognized him from newspapers, from the business section articles she'd stopped reading after the divorce. Kenneth's primary rival in commercial real estate, the man he'd spent years trying to outbid and outmaneuver. His presence here made no sense unless he was representing creditors. The thought sent a chill through Rebecca. Kenneth had always played games with leverage and risk. Maybe his empire wasn't as solid as it appeared. Jonathan Pierce entered last, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. He was older than his phone voice suggested, with reading glasses and a demeanor that suggested he'd spent decades delivering news, both good and terrible. He settled behind the conference table, adjusting his glasses. "Thank you all for coming. This is the formal reading of Kenneth Whitmore's last will and testament. I'll begin with the charitable bequests." What that lawyer didn't know was the woman sitting across from him had sold her wedding ring that morning just to keep the lights on for one more week. Rebecca had walked into the pawn shop at 8 a.m. before changing her mind and coming here. The ring sat in her pocket, now a small circle of gold and broken promises. $180. That was what 20 years reduced to. Jonathan read through a list of charitable donations, each one carefully calibrated for maximum tax benefit and public relations value. $2 million to Harvard, $1 million to the Museum of Modern Art, $500,000 to cancer research. Kenneth's generosity on full display, his name carved into buildings and scholarship funds and donor walls. Then came the real assets. The primary residence at 4,400 Lakeshore Drive, including all furnishings and vehicles I leave to my wife, Kimberly Ashford Whitmore. Kimberly's smile was small and satisfied. The mansion was worth $12 million minimum. Rebecca had seen photos in magazines, the kind of home that required a staff to maintain. The stock portfolio held in Whitmore Development Corporation, currently valued at approximately $42 million, I leave to Kimberly Ashford Whitmore. Richard Brennan shifted in his chair, making notes. Rebecca sat perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable moment when her name would be read and the final insult delivered. The private art collection valued at $6 million I leave to Kimberly Ashford Whitmore. The vacation properties in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard I leave to Kimberly Ashford Whitmore. The list continued each bequest, another confirmation that Kenneth had died the way he'd lived in recent years, devoted to acquiring things and the woman who appreciated their value. Rebecca felt nothing. The numbness was almost comforting, a familiar armor against disappointment. Finally, Jonathan Pierce turned to the last page. His voice dropped half an octave, taking on a tone Rebecca couldn't quite interpret. And to my former wife, Rebecca Morrison. Rebecca's spine straightened automatically, muscle memory from years of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jonathan adjusted his glasses, reading verbatim from the document. To Rebecca, who always claimed she never cared about my money and only wanted my heart, I leave the exact sum of $1 single. May it serve as a final reminder of what her loyalty was worth to me. Silence crashed into the room like a physical force. Rebecca heard it in stereo, the absence of sound from her own shock, and the small, poorly disguised scoff from Kimberly's direction. Even Richard Brennan looked uncomfortable, his pen frozen mid-note. Jonathan Pierce reached into his jacket pocket and produced a crisp new dollar bill. He slid it across the polished conference table toward Rebecca. For a long moment, she simply stared at the green paper. The insult was so perfectly Kenneth, calculated, petty, designed to humiliate in front of witnesses, to reduce 20 years of marriage and partnership to a single dollar's worth of contempt. Then something unexpected happened. Rebecca smiled. The smile broke into a soft chuckle, which escalated into full laughter. The sound echoed off the glass windows and expensive artwork, genuine and unrestrained. Not the hysterical laughter of someone broken, but something cleaner. Relief. Liberation. The final thread connecting her to Kenneth's toxic approval had just been cut, and she was free. Kimberly's smug expression faltered, replaced by confused irritation. "Is there something amusing about this?" Rebecca stood smoothing the wrinkles from her navy skirt. She walked to the table and picked up the dollar bill, holding it up to the light. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket alongside the engagement ring. Her voice came out steady, remarkably light. "No, Kimberly, it's just that Kenneth spent his entire life terrified people only wanted him for his money. Even in death, he couldn't stop trying to buy the last word." She turned toward the door, then paused, and looked back at Kimberly. "You can keep the mansion. Keep all of it. I've got exactly what I came for, proof that I survived him." Rebecca walked out of the conference room, leaving the heavy door open behind her. She rode the elevator down 40 floors, with her head high, feeling lighter than she had in years. The final cord tying her to Kenneth's judgment had been severed. She was free. Outside, the city moved through its Monday afternoon with indifferent energy. Rebecca stood on the sidewalk, the dollar bill in her pocket, and let herself feel the full weight of closure. No more wondering if Kenneth regretted his choices. No more hoping he'd remember he had a daughter. Just this $1 and the freedom that came from expecting nothing. She walked 6 blocks before she realized where she was going. The ice cream cart on the corner of 5th and Market, the one with the faded umbrella, and the vendor who'd been working that spot for 20 years. Rebecca approached, pulling out the dollar bill. "1 vanilla cone, please." The vendor made change, but Rebecca waved it away. "Keep it." She carried the cone carefully, taking the bus back across the city. Melissa met her at the door with Autumn, who'd been picked up from school and was bouncing with barely contained energy. "Mommy, you're back. Did you get presents from Daddy?" Rebecca knelt holding out the ice cream cone. Autumn's eyes went wide, that particular shine that only ice cream could produce in a 7-year-old. "I got something better, baby. I got proof that we don't need presents. We've got each other." Autumn grabbed the cone, already licking the vanilla before it could drip. Rebecca watched her daughter's face light up with simple joy, the kind that came from small pleasures and not expecting more than the moment could hold. That afternoon, Rebecca used Kenneth's final insult to buy her daughter the first ice cream they'd had in 6 months. Sometimes the best revenge is refusing to be broken. That night, Autumn fell asleep early, sugar-crashed, and content. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, the dollar bill laid flat beside the eviction notice. 11 days remaining. $1 and an ice cream cone's worth of closure wouldn't stop the sheriff from coming, but something had shifted. The weight she'd been carrying, the invisible burden of Kenneth's judgment and her own failure to measure up, had evaporated. She'd walked into that office expecting another reminder of her worthlessness. Instead, she'd found the final piece of evidence she needed. She had survived. Against prenuptial agreements and abandonment and 4 years of poverty and single parenthood and 100 small indignities, she had survived. Kenneth was dead, and she was here, still fighting, still loving her daughter, still refusing to let his cruelty define her worth. Rebecca folded the dollar bill carefully and placed it in an envelope. Someday, when Autumn was old enough to understand, she'd explain what this dollar meant. Not failure, not worthlessness, but freedom. The price she'd paid to finally stop measuring herself against a dead man's contempt. She was about to turn off the kitchen light when heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. 3 sharp knocks rattled the apartment door. Rebecca froze. Eviction enforcements didn't come at night, and she wasn't expecting visitors. She moved to the peephole, her heart accelerating. Jonathan Pierce stood in the hallway looking distinctly out of place in his expensive suit against the backdrop of peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. Rebecca unlocked the deadbolt, opening the door just wide enough to block the view of her cramped apartment. "Mr. Pierce, if Kenneth remembered he owes me quarters from 1999, you can keep them. I'm done." Jonathan Pierce didn't smile. His expression carried an intensity that hadn't been present in the conference room, a seriousness that made Rebecca's stomach tighten. "Rebecca, please let me inside. This isn't a social call, and we don't have much time." Rebecca stepped aside reluctantly, letting Jonathan enter the narrow hallway that smelled of other people's cooking and decades of accumulated living. He moved carefully, as if afraid the expensive fabric of his suit might absorb the poverty clinging to the walls. Autumn appeared in the bedroom doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her pajamas had cartoon bears on them, a thrift store find from 3 Christmases ago. "Mommy, who's the fancy man?" Jonathan's expression softened fractionally when he saw the child. Rebecca positioned herself between them, protective instincts firing on all cylinders. "Baby, go back to bed. This won't take long." Autumn studied Jonathan with the unsettling directness of 7-year-olds, then padded back into the bedroom and closed the door. Through the thin walls, Rebecca could hear her settling back onto the pull-out mattress they shared. Jonathan waited until the sounds quieted before speaking, his voice low and urgent. "You need to call your work. Tell them you won't be in tomorrow. Pack a bag for yourself and Autumn. Enough for 2 days. My car is waiting downstairs." Rebecca crossed her arms, anger flaring hot and immediate. "I don't take orders from Kenneth's lawyers anymore. We concluded our business this morning with that ridiculous dollar. I have bread to bake." That dollar bill was a highly specific legal mechanism. Jonathan pulled a thin folder from inside his coat, the motion careful and deliberate. He opened it on the kitchen table, pushing aside the eviction notice and calculator to make room. It was coded acceptance of a secondary classified addendum to the will, an addendum that Kimberly Whitmore knows absolutely nothing about. Rebecca's heart skipped the floor, tilting slightly beneath her feet. "What are you talking about?" Kenneth Whitmore was many things, but he wasn't a fool. Jonathan paced the short length of the living room, his footsteps muffled by worn carpet that had given up its pattern years ago. 16 months ago, Kenneth noticed irregularities in one of his private subsidiary accounts. Small discrepancies at first, the kind that might be clerical errors. But Kenneth didn't believe in coincidences. He hired me to conduct a quiet investigation. He pulled a photograph from the folder, sliding it across the table. The image showed Kimberly and Richard Brennan sitting at an outdoor cafe, their body language speaking volumes. Kimberly's hand on Richard's arm, his face leaning close to hers, the intimacy unmistakable. Kimberly was having an affair with Kenneth's primary business rival, but that was just the surface. Jonathan produced more documents, spreading them across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Bank statements, emailed transcripts, bidding documents with highlighted sections. Richard Brennan's company had been systematically underbidding Kenneth on major city contracts for the past year, projects worth hundreds of millions. Kenneth couldn't understand how Brennan always seemed to know his numbers could always come in just low enough to win. Then we discovered Kimberly was feeding him classified information from Kenneth's files. Rebecca sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, layers of deception built on top of calculated theft. They were planning to bankrupt him. Worse, they were planning to steal his liquid assets and destroy his reputation simultaneously. Jonathan pulled out another document, this one dense with financial terminology that made Rebecca's head swim. Kenneth discovered that over 14 months, approximately $3.2 million had been siphoned from various accounts into offshore holdings. Kimberly and Brennan planned to drain another $50 million, then Kimberly would file for divorce, citing abuse. She'd walk away with the visible assets, Brennan would absorb Kenneth's company at bankruptcy prices, and they'd disappear to Monaco with everything Kenneth spent 40 years building. Rebecca stared at the papers, trying to process the scale of calculation required to execute such a plan. Kimberly hadn't just married Kenneth for money. She'd married him to systematically destroy him. But none of this explains why you're here, why you're telling me. Jonathan's expression shifted, something darker moving behind his professional mask. Because that wasn't the worst of what we found. He produced a final document, this one marked with a laboratory logo. Chemical analysis report, pharmacological breakdown of compounds found in Kenneth Whitmore's private Scotch decanter. Rebecca scanned the technical language, not understanding half the terms, but catching enough to feel ice spreading through her chest. synthetic compounds, cardiac stress accelerant, undetectable in standard toxicology screens. Kimberly was poisoning him. The words came out flat statement, rather than question. Jonathan nodded. Kenneth's private investigator, Timothy Crawford, found trace residue in medications Kimberly kept in her vanity. We had it analyzed. It's designed to elevate blood pressure, gradually accelerate existing heart conditions, make natural death appear inevitable. Kenneth was 62, with a documented history of cardiac issues. No coroner would look twice at a heart attack on a golf course. Rebecca thought about Kenneth collapsing in the afternoon sun, surrounded by people who would assume age and stress had finally caught up with him. No one investigating, no one questioning. Kimberly playing the grieving widow while planning her escape. Why didn't he go to the police with this evidence? She'd go to prison for attempted murder, actual murder, if the chemicals killed him. Because Kenneth wanted something the justice system couldn't provide. He wanted total destruction. Jonathan began gathering the documents, organizing them back into careful order. Kenneth spent his whole life building an empire. The idea of Kimberly and Brennan profiting from his death, living well on stolen wealth while he rotted in the ground, was intolerable. So he engineered something more permanent. He pulled out a different folder, this one embossed with a corporate logo Rebecca didn't recognize. Vanguard Fiduciary Services. Over the past 14 months, Kenneth quietly moved his actual wealth, the clean assets with real value, into an irrevocable blind trust managed by a private entity. He left Kimberly everything you saw listed in the will, the mansion, the cars, the stock portfolio, but he'd already drained the equity from all of it, saddled everything with hidden debt and toxic liabilities. By the end of this month, creditors will descend, the mansion will be foreclosed, the stocks will prove worthless, and Kimberly will be drowning in legal bills and bankruptcy proceedings. Rebecca felt a cold admiration for the brutality of the revenge. Kenneth had given Kimberly exactly what she wanted, wrapped in poison. The trust required a specific legal trigger to activate upon Kenneth's death without alerting probate courts or Kimberly's attorneys. Jonathan met Rebecca's eyes directly. That trigger was documented voluntary acceptance of a $1 physical asset during the official will reading. The apartment seemed to contract around Rebecca, the air thawing. She reached into her pocket, feeling the folded dollar bill against her fingertips. "You're telling me by taking that dollar this morning, I triggered something. You formally accepted the terms of the Vanguard Trust. Get your coat, Rebecca. Pack a bag for autumn. We have a 3-hour drive ahead of us, and I need you both out of the city before Kimberly realizes what's happening." Rebecca stood, her mind racing through implications and impossibilities. Kenneth had set her up. Even in death, he was manipulating her, pulling strings she hadn't known existed. "I can't just leave. I have work. My father's in a state facility. Autumn has school." "Your father can be moved to private care by Thursday. I've already arranged transport and a medical team. Autumn can be enrolled in a better school district starting next week. As for work, you won't need to bake bread ever again unless you choose to." Jonathan's voice carried absolute certainty, the confidence of someone delivering facts rather than promises. "Rebecca Kenneth left you $90 million. You're not poor anymore. You haven't been since 10:15 this morning when you picked up that dollar and walked out of my conference room." The number didn't land. It was too large, too abstract. Rebecca had spent 4 years counting quarters, stretching dollar bills across impossible gaps between paychecks and due dates. 90 million existed in a different reality, one she couldn't map onto her own life. Autumn appeared in the bedroom doorway, again fully awake now and intensely curious. "Mommy, are we going on an adventure?" Rebecca looked at her daughter, then at Jonathan, then at the eviction notice still sitting on the table. 11 days. That timeline had just become irrelevant. If someone who abandoned you tried to make amends after death, would you accept it? The question formed in Rebecca's mind, unbidden, hooking into the tangled mess of anger and grief and confusion swirling through her chest. Kenneth had left her with nothing, forced her into poverty, refused to acknowledge his own daughter, and now he was offering everything, but only after he was gone, only after the gesture cost him nothing. Was accepting it forgiveness or just survival? "Give me 20 minutes." Rebecca moved through the apartment on autopilot, pulling clothes from drawers, stuffing them into a duffel bag that had seen better decades. She packed for Autumn first, making sure to include the stuffed bear Melissa had given her. Then her own things, the sum total of her wardrobe fitting easily into one bag. She called Melissa from the bedroom, keeping her voice low. "I need you to check on my father tomorrow. Tell him I'll explain everything soon, but I'm okay. Better than okay." Melissa's voice carried sleepy confusion. "Rebecca, it's almost 10 p.m. What's going on? Kenneth's lawyer is here. There's more to the will than what we thought. I need to go somewhere tonight, and I'm taking Autumn. Can you cover my shift tomorrow?" "Of course, but I promise I'll explain everything. Just trust me. Please." She hung up before Melissa could ask more questions, before she had to put into words something she didn't fully understand herself. Autumn dressed quickly, excited by the unexpected nighttime adventure. She chattered while Rebecca helped her into her coat, questions tumbling over each other faster than Rebecca could answer. "Where are we going? Is it far? Will there be breakfast? Can I bring my crayons?" "Yes, baby. Bring whatever you want." They walked downstairs together, Rebecca carrying both bags while Autumn clutched her bear. Jonathan's car waited at the curb, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver behind the wheel who nodded but didn't speak. The back seat was leather and spacious, another world compared to the bus routes Rebecca knew by heart. Autumn climbed in eagerly, pressing her face against the window to watch the city lights blur past as the driver pulled into traffic. Jonathan sat in the front passenger seat, turned halfway to address Rebecca. "There's more you need to understand. The investigation Kenneth commissioned went deeper than financial records and chemical analysis. He wanted to know everything about Kimberly and Brennan, their plans, their communications, their endgame." He handed back a tablet computer, the screen showing a transcript of text messages. These were recovered from Kimberly's phone. Timothy Crawford used specialized software to extract deleted conversations. Read the ones from last month. Rebecca scrolled through the messages, her stomach twisting tighter with each line. "Kay, he's getting sicker. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. R, good. Then we move the final transfer and you file. K, what if someone suspects R? Nobody will. Old man with heart problems. Natural causes. You play the widow, wait for probate, and we're gone. K, Monaco, by summer. R, Monaco, by summer. Everything we planned." Rebecca handed the tablet back, unable to read more. The casual cruelty of it, the way they discussed Kenneth's death like a business transaction, made her feel physically ill. Autumn had fallen asleep against Rebecca's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. Rebecca stroked her daughter's hair, anchoring herself in something innocent and real, Kenneth knew all this. He knew. He read every message, saw every photograph, understood exactly what they were doing to him, and he chose not to stop it. Jonathan's voice carried something almost like respect. He let Kimberly poison him, let the chemicals do their work, because he'd already set the trap, and dying was the trigger that would spring it. Rebecca stared out the window at darkness punctuated by highway lights. Kenneth had engineered his own death to ensure his revenge would be absolute. The realization was horrifying and impressive in equal measure. That's insane. It's calculated. Kenneth built his fortune on understanding leverage and timing. This was his final deal, structured to give him the last word from beyond the grave. The drive stretched on highway, becoming country road, becoming unmarked lanes that wound through forest so dense the headlights barely penetrated. Autumn woke briefly, asked if they were almost there, then drifted back to sleep when Rebecca assured her it wouldn't be much longer. 2 hours into the journey, Rebecca noticed they'd lost cell signal. No bars, no GPS, just the driver navigating from memory through roads that didn't appear on any map. "Where exactly are we going?" "Silvermere Estate. Kenneth purchased it 8 years ago under a shell corporation. Nobody in his public life knew it existed. Not Kimberly, not his business partners, not even most of his legal team. He used it as a retreat, a place to think, without the performance his public image required." The trees finally thinned, revealing iron gates that opened automatically as the car approached. The driveway crunched under tires, white gravel, gleaming in the headlights. Then the house emerged from the darkness like something from a different century. Colonial Revival architecture had all stone and symmetry lit by subtle landscape lighting that made it look both welcoming and imposing. Wings extended from the central structure, creating courtyards and covered walkways. Beyond the house, Rebecca could see the dark mirror of a lake reflecting stars. Autumn woke fully as the car stopped, her eyes going wide. "Mommy, it's like a castle. Are we really staying here?" Rebecca couldn't answer. She was too busy processing the sheer scale of what Kenneth had hidden. This wasn't just a house. It was an estate, the kind of property that required staff and maintenance and money she couldn't begin to calculate. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman in her 60s, dressed in practical clothes that suggested authority rather than service, stood in the entrance. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her accent when she spoke carried the precise consonants of educated British English. "Mrs. Morrison, and this must be Autumn. Welcome to Silvermere. I'm Margaret Holland, the estate manager. Mr. Whitmore told me about you both." Autumn hid halfway behind Rebecca, suddenly shy in the face of such formality. Rebecca found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Kenneth told you about us." "He did. He said his daughter had her mother's eyes and deserved better than he'd given her." Margaret's gaze dropped to Autumn, her expression softening. "There's a room prepared for you upstairs, young lady, with a proper bed and more pillows than any reasonable person needs. Are you hungry? I can have cook prepare something." Autumn looked up at Rebecca, seeking permission. Rebecca nodded, still too overwhelmed to form complete thoughts. Margaret led them inside through an entrance hall that featured a sweeping staircase and chandelier that probably cost more than Rebecca's entire apartment building. The floors were marble, the walls adorned with artwork that looked museum quality. Jonathan touched Rebecca's elbow, guiding her toward a different corridor. Margaret will settle Autumn. You and I need to talk in the study. There's documentation you need to see, letters Kenneth left specifically for you. Rebecca glanced back at Autumn, who was already chattering to Margaret about the chandelier and asking if real princesses had ever lived here. Margaret handled the questions with practiced patience, her hand gentle on Autumn's shoulder as they climbed the stairs. The study was wood-paneled and intimate despite its size, dominated by a massive desk positioned before bay windows that would offer lake views in daylight. Jonathan moved to the desk, opening a drawer and removing a leather folder. The Vanguard Trust documents. Everything transferred to your name as of this morning. He spread papers across the desk surface, official documents, heavy with legal language and notary stamps. Silvermere Estate, appraised at $12 million, liquid assets and secure investments totaling $78 million, all tax-sheltered, all legally impenetrable, all yours. Rebecca sank into the chair behind the desk, her legs finally giving up the pretense of supporting her weight. The numbers blurred together, too large to feel real. Why Kenneth spent 4 years making sure I got nothing. He never even met Autumn. Why would he do this? Read his letter. Jonathan placed an envelope on the desk, Rebecca's name written across it in Kenneth's sharp handwriting. She recognized the aggressive slant of the letters, the way he pressed too hard with the pen. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, unfolding pages that felt both familiar and strange. Rebecca, I was a fool. You loved me when I was nobody. I built an empire and forgot that. Kimberly loved my money, my status, my power. You loved me. By the time I realized the difference, it was too late. I'm dying. Kimberly is poisoning me with compounds designed to accelerate heart failure. I could stop her, could expose her, could watch her go to prison, but I deserve this death. I chose money over you, chose empire over family. Let another woman into my bed and my accounts, while you struggled alone with my daughter, our daughter. I watched Autumn from a distance these past years, hired investigators to photograph her, send me reports on her progress. I know about her 7th birthday last month, about the cupcake you brought home from work because you couldn't afford a real cake. I know about the eviction notice. I know what my choices cost you both. This is my apology. Not enough, never enough, but everything I have left to give. The dollar was a test. If you laughed instead of cried, if you walked out of that office with your head high, I'd know you survived me. You won. Kimberly gets the poisoned inheritance, the empire that will collapse and bury her. You get the truth. You get freedom. You get everything I should have given you 20 years ago. The estate is Autumn's legacy. The money is yours to build whatever life you want, and the choice in the red folder is yours alone. I leave you power over the woman who killed me. Use it or don't. Either way, you're free. I'm sorry I couldn't say this to your face. I'm sorry for everything. Kenneth. Rebecca read it twice, tears blurring the words the second time through. Kenneth's guilt bled through every sentence, the weight of his regret almost palpable on the page. He'd known about Autumn's birthday, about the cupcake, about the eviction notice. He'd been watching, keeping tabs, witnessing their struggles from a distance while doing nothing to help. Until now. Until death made helping impossible and necessary in equal measure. Jonathan waited silently, giving her time to process. When Rebecca finally looked up, He placed another folder on the desk. This one was deep red marked with Timothy Crawford's investigation firm logo. This is everything we gathered on Kimberly and Richard Brennan. Photographs, bank records, email transcripts, the chemical analysis of the poison, witness statements from people who saw them together. It's comprehensive enough to secure federal indictments for corporate espionage, financial fraud, and first-degree murder. Rebecca opened the folder, seeing page after page of documented betrayal. Photos of Kimberly and Brennan in hotel rooms, financial transfers to offshore accounts, email chains discussing the timeline for Kenneth's death. One photo showed Kimberly at a pharmacy, the timestamp 3 weeks before Kenneth's heart attack. The next page was a receipt for a prescription that didn't match any medication Kenneth had been prescribed by his actual doctors. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because Kenneth wanted you to have the final choice. He knew he treated you terribly during the divorce, left you with nothing while he chased younger women and bigger deals. This estate, this money, this is his way of apologizing. But this folder, this evidence, this is his way of giving you power." Jonathan's expression was unreadable professional mask, firmly in place. "You're the sole trustee of the Vanguard Trust. You can bury this evidence and let Kimberly drown in the financial ruin Kenneth engineered. Or you can hand it to federal prosecutors and watch her spend the rest of her life in prison for murder. The karma is in your hands now." Rebecca stared at the red folder, feeling the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders. Kenneth had been poisoned, systematically killed by a woman who married him for money and stayed long enough to execute her plan. Justice demanded consequences. The legal system existed precisely for situations like this, but Rebecca had spent 4 years learning that justice and revenge weren't the same thing. She'd survived by letting go of anger, by refusing to let Kenneth's abandonment define her worth. Taking this evidence to prosecutors would mean months of trials, media attention, her life, and autumns dragged through public scrutiny while lawyers argued over toxicology reports and email timestamps. It would mean staying connected to Kenneth's legacy, to the toxic web of his final days, to a drama that would consume whatever peace she might find here. "I need time to think." Jonathan nodded, standing. "Take all the time you need. The evidence isn't going anywhere, and Kimberly's financial collapse will keep her occupied for weeks. Margaret has prepared rooms for you both. Rest, process. Tomorrow we can discuss the practical details of managing the trust." He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Rebecca Kenneth was right about one thing. You did survive him. You're still standing while his empire crumbles. That's the only victory that truly matters. After Jonathan left, Rebecca sat alone in the study, Kenneth's letter in one hand and the red folder in the other. Outside the bay windows, the lake reflected moonlight in shimmering patterns that looked almost alive. She thought about Autumn upstairs, probably already asleep in a bed more comfortable than anything she'd ever known. She thought about her father in the state facility, his Parkinson's slowly stealing his mobility and memory. She thought about Melissa, working double shifts at the bakery, about all the women struggling alone, while men like Kenneth built empires and forgot the people they'd promised to love. The estate was silent around her, vast and full of possibility. Kenneth had given her everything, but the gift came wrapped in guilt and revenge and choices she'd never asked to make. Rebecca placed the red folder in the desk drawer and locked it. Not a decision, just a postponement. Right now she needed sleep and clarity and time to understand what freedom actually meant when it came with $90 million and the power to destroy lives. She climbed the stairs, following the sound of Autumn's soft breathing, to a bedroom that looked like something from a magazine. Margaret had left a nightlight burning, casting gentle shadows across walls, painted in soothing blues. Autumn lay sprawled across a four-poster bed, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm, completely at peace, in a way Rebecca hadn't seen in months. No stress about rent, no worry about eviction, just a child sleeping safely in a comfortable bed. Rebecca stood in the doorway watching her daughter breathe, feeling the full weight of transformation settling over her life like snow. This morning, she'd been counting days until eviction. Tonight, she was standing in a $12 million estate, her daughter sleeping in sheets that probably cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Kenneth had engineered this reversal with the same calculated precision he'd brought to every deal. But unlike his business transactions, this one came with no contract, no fine print, no escape clause. It was final and irrevocable and hers. She closed Autumn's door gently and found her own room across the hall, equally luxurious, but more subdued. Margaret had unpacked her duffel bag, hanging Rebecca's few clothes in a closet designed for 10 times that volume. Rebecca showered in a bathroom with heated floors and water pressure she'd forgotten existed, then lay down in a bed that felt like floating. Sleep should have been impossible, with her mind racing through everything Jonathan had revealed. But exhaustion won out, pulling her under into dreams that mixed dollar bills and eviction notices and Kenneth's handwriting spelling out apologies that came 4 years too late. Morning arrived through unfamiliar windows, sunlight painting the bedroom in shades Rebecca had forgotten existed. She woke, disoriented, reaching automatically for Autumn, before remembering the four-poster bed across the hall. The estate, the impossible transformation of her entire existence. Autumn was already awake, standing at the window in her pajamas, watching the lake shimmer in early light. "Mommy, there are swans. Real swans, like in the movies." Rebecca joined her at the window, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. The estate grounds stretched out in carefully maintained beauty, the kind of landscape that required professional care and unlimited resources. A dock extended into the lake, and yes, 2 white swans glided across the surface with oblivious grace. "Can we go see them after breakfast?" "We can do whatever you want, baby." The phrase felt strange in Rebecca's mouth, weighted with new truth. Money changed. The grammar of possibility transformed can't into can with frightening speed. Margaret appeared at the bedroom door, knocking softly before entering with a breakfast tray. "I took the liberty of preparing something light. Mr. Pierce will arrive at 10 to discuss arrangements for your father's transfer. In the meantime, Autumn, would you like to see the library? It has a children's section with books dating back to when Mr. Whitmore was young." Autumn's eyes lit up, and she followed Margaret downstairs before Rebecca could finish her coffee. The silence that followed felt both peaceful and unsettling. Rebecca dressed in clothes that looked shabby against the bedroom's elegance, then wandered the halls, trying to map the estate's geography. She found Kenneth's private office on the 2nd floor, a room Margaret hadn't mentioned during last night's abbreviated tour. The door was unlocked, and curiosity pulled Rebecca inside. The space was masculine and sparse, dominated by a desk and filing cabinets. But one wall stopped Rebecca cold. Photographs covered it floor to ceiling, arranged in chronological order, like a timeline of everything Kenneth had missed. Autumn as a newborn, red-faced and tiny in a hospital blanket. Autumn at 6 months, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. First birthday, first steps, first day of kindergarten. Every milestone documented by someone Kenneth had paid to watch from a distance. Rebecca's hands trembled as she traced the progression, seeing her daughter grow through a stranger's lens. Kenneth had been there, in a way, witnessing, recording, never approaching, never offering help, but unable to completely sever the connection. One photograph near the bottom showed Autumn's 7th birthday. The timestamp read, 3 weeks ago. Rebecca could see herself in the background emerging from the apartment building with a cupcake on a paper plate. The photographer had captured Autumn's face perfectly, the mixture of hope and resignation that broke Rebecca's heart. Kenneth had known, had seen, had done nothing until death made action safe. She left the office feeling hollowed out, unable to decide if the photos represented caring or cruelty, maybe both. Maybe Kenneth himself hadn't known the difference. Jonathan arrived precisely at 10, accompanied by a medical transport team who'd already retrieved Edward Morrison from the state facility. Rebecca met them in the circular driveway, watching attendants carefully transfer her father from the transport van to a wheelchair. Edward's Parkinson's had worsened since her last visit. His tremors more pronounced, but his eyes were sharp when they found hers. "Daughter, this is quite the upgrade from my previous accommodations." His voice carried dry humor, the survival mechanism that had carried him through a lifetime of disappointments. "It's complicated, Dad." "Most things worth having are." Margaret directed the medical team to the East Wing, where rooms had been converted into a private care suite, complete with monitoring equipment and a nursing station. Edward wheeled himself to the window, looking out over the grounds with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read. Kenneth Whitmore bought all this 8 years ago, kept it secret from everyone. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his trembling hands gripping the wheelchair armrests. "I knew him before you met him, you know. Knew his father, Thomas Whitmore. Good man, built a decent construction business, then lost everything in the recession of '83. Bankruptcy wiped them out. Kenneth was 16, watched his father sell everything, including family photographs, to pay creditors." Rebecca sat on the edge of the medical bed, processing this new information. "He never told me any of that. He always made it sound like he built his empire from ambition, not fear." "Fear's a powerful architect, Rebecca." Kenneth spent his whole life terrified of being poor again. That kind of hunger, it drives men to build mountains, but it also makes them cruel. They forget how to see people as anything except threats to their security. Edward's explanation didn't excuse Kenneth's choices, but it added context Rebecca hadn't possessed. Kenneth hadn't just been greedy. He'd been traumatized, running from a past that had taught him money was the only protection against disaster. "He left me all this because he felt guilty." Guilt can be its own kind of love when a man's broken enough that he can't express the real thing. That afternoon, while Autumn explored the grounds with Margaret, Rebecca turned on the television in the study and found Kenneth's empire collapse playing out across business news channels. The coverage was brutal and gleeful in equal measure. Kimberly Whitmore, the young widow who'd inherited millions, was now facing foreclosure on multiple properties. The downtown mansion had been seized by First Continental Bank, the luxury vehicles repossessed by dealerships who'd discovered the titles were encumbered by loans Kenneth had taken out months before his death. The stock portfolio Kimberly had inherited was revealed to be largely worthless shell companies with impressive names and no actual assets. Financial analysts were calling it the most sophisticated posthumous revenge in corporate history, praising Kenneth's ruthless brilliance even as they documented Kimberly's destruction. One news segment showed footage of Kimberly leaving a lawyer's office pursued by reporters shouting questions. She looked nothing like the polished woman from the will reading. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her hair pulled back carelessly, her face bare of makeup and etched with panic. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it true you're facing bankruptcy?" "Mrs. Whitmore, did you know about the debts when you married Kenneth Whitmore?" She pushed through them without answering, climbing into a rental car that looked absurdly ordinary against her former lifestyle. Autumn wandered into the study, drawn by the television noise. "Mommy, who's that sad lady?" Rebecca muted the volume, considering how much truth a 7-year-old could handle. Someone who made bad choices. Now she's facing consequences. Like when I lie about brushing my teeth and you find out. Something like that, baby, but bigger. When someone destroys themselves through their own greed, is watching them fall revenge, or just justice running its course? The question circled Rebecca's mind as she watched Kimberly's collapse unfold. She hadn't done anything except accept a dollar bill and exist. Kenneth's revenge was automatic, triggered by his death, executing itself with mechanical precision. Rebecca was just a witness to karma working itself out. 3 days into their residence at Silvermere, a visitor arrived unannounced. Margaret appeared in the library where Rebecca was attempting to read through trust documents, her expression carefully neutral. "There's a Mr. Timothy Crawford at the gate. He says Kenneth Whitmore hired him, and he has materials he was instructed to deliver personally." Rebecca remembered the name from Jonathan's explanation, the private investigator who documented Kimberly's betrayal. "Send him in." Timothy Crawford was 45 and compact, with the watchful eyes of someone trained to observe without being observed. He carried a leather briefcase that he set on the library table with careful precision. "Mrs. Morrison, I apologize for arriving without notice. Kenneth paid me to deliver these materials exactly 1 week after his death, directly to you with no intermediaries." He opened the briefcase, revealing USB drives, folders, and a stack of cassette tapes that looked anachronistic against the modern technology. "These are the complete investigation files. Everything Jonathan Pierce showed you, plus additional materials Kenneth recorded himself during his final months." Timothy produced a small cassette player, the kind that hadn't been common in decades. "Kenneth went to therapy starting 6 months before he died, but he didn't trust therapists with the truth, so he recorded his own sessions, private confessions he never shared with anyone except himself. He wanted you to hear them." Rebecca's hand hovered over the cassette player, uncertain whether she wanted this level of access to Kenneth's final thoughts. Why would he record himself? My professional opinion. He knew he was dying and wanted to leave evidence of his mental state, proof that his choices were calculated rather than confused. For legal purposes, in case Kimberly tried to contest the will on grounds of diminished capacity. Timothy pressed play on the first tape. Kenneth's voice filled the library, rough with scotch and sickness. "Recording 37. It's been 4 months since I confirmed the poisoning. Kimberly thinks I don't notice the way my chest tightens after the evening drink she prepares. The doctors say my heart is weakening naturally, age and stress. They don't know about the compounds accelerating the process. I could stop it. dump the scotch, confront her, call the police. But what would that accomplish? She'd go to prison. Brennan would take over my company anyway, and I'd still die eventually. This way, I control the timeline. I control the message. I give her everything she wants wrapped in poison she won't taste until it's too late. The recording continued, Kenneth's voice moving between bitter philosophy and raw confession. I hired someone to photograph Autumn today. 7 years old now. Rebecca brought home a cupcake from work for her birthday. I spent $42 million on the downtown waterfront project last year. Couldn't spare enough to buy my own daughter a real cake. What kind of man does that make me? The kind who deserves what Kimberly's doing to me, probably. Rebecca's throat tightened, hearing Kenneth acknowledge what he'd refused to say in life. Timothy fast-forwarded through several tapes, stopping on one dated 3 weeks before Kenneth's death. I'm leaving everything to Rebecca. Not because she deserves it, though she does. Not because I feel guilty, though I do. But because she's the only person who ever loved me for who I was instead of what I could provide. 20 years ago, she loved a man with nothing. I repaid that loyalty by choosing empire over family, by walking away when she needed me, by pretending our daughter didn't exist because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging my failure. This estate, this money, it's not forgiveness. You can't buy forgiveness. But maybe it's restitution. Maybe it's the only apology I'm capable of making. The tape clicked off, leaving silence that felt heavy and complicated. Timothy placed another folder on the table, this one marked with red tabs. These are audio recordings from Kimberly's phone, conversations with Richard Brennan discussing timing, discussing dosages, discussing their plans after your ex-husband's death, everything you'd need to secure murder convictions. He pulled out his phone, navigating to a saved file. This was recorded 1 week before Kenneth died. I think you should hear it. He pressed play. Kimberly's voice, slightly tinny through phone compression, but unmistakable. 2 more doses, maybe 3. His doctor said the heart could go any day now. Richard Brennan's response carried satisfaction and impatience in equal measure. Then we moved the final accounts. Monaco by summer. Monaco by summer. Everything we planned. You're sure there's no way this traces back to us? He's 62 with documented heart disease. The coroner will sign off on natural causes without a second thought. I'll play the grieving widow, inherit everything, and we disappear. The recording ended. Timothy put his phone away, his expression professionally blank. Kenneth listened to this 3 days before his heart attack. He knew exactly what was coming. He could have gone to the police, could have exposed them both. Instead, he finished restructuring his assets and went golfing. Rebecca felt sick, imagining Kenneth knowing death was imminent, choosing it anyway because revenge mattered more than survival. He committed suicide by proxy. Legally, no, but practically, yes. He let her kill him because his revenge required his death to trigger. That's the level of calculation we're dealing with. Timothy began packing up the materials, leaving the folders and recordings on the table. These are yours now. Kenneth paid me to deliver them, nothing more. What you do with this evidence is entirely your decision. But I'll say this, I've spent 20 years investigating people. Kimberly Ashford is drowning in debt, watching everything collapse, and she knows she can't outrun it. Prison might actually be a relief compared to what Kenneth engineered for her. After Timothy left, Rebecca sat alone with the recordings and files spread before her. Kenneth's voice still echoed in her memory, confessing guilt while orchestrating revenge, acknowledging his failures while ensuring they'd never be repeated. The red folder held enough evidence to put Kimberly in prison for life. Federal prosecutors would celebrate a case this airtight. Murder, conspiracy, corporate fraud. The trial would be media spectacle. Kenneth's death re-examined every detail of his poisoning, exposed to public scrutiny. And Rebecca would be at the center of it, the ex-wife who brought down the killer, the woman scorned who finally got justice. But justice felt less satisfying than she'd imagined. Kimberly was already destroyed, her life imploding exactly as Kenneth had designed. Adding prison seemed redundant, like kicking someone already on the ground. More than that, pursuing prosecution meant staying tangled in Kenneth's legacy, meant courtrooms and testimony, and reliving his death over and over while lawyers argued about toxicology and timelines. Rebecca thought about Autumn laughing with Margaret in the gardens, free from the weight of adult complications. She thought about her father finally receiving proper medical care, his tremors managed by medication the state facility could never afford. She thought about Melissa, still working double shifts at the bakery, about all the women struggling alone because men decided money mattered more than family. She locked the red folder in the desk drawer, not making a decision, but deferring one. Right now, she needed to focus on building something new rather than destroying what was already falling apart. 2 weeks passed in strange domesticity. Autumn adjusted to private tutoring, while Rebecca worked with Jonathan to understand the trust's full scope. The money was real, invested wisely, generating returns that made her former poverty feel like a distant nightmare. Edward's health improved under professional care, his medication adjusted properly for the first time in years. He spent afternoons in the library reading newspapers and occasionally offering sardonic commentary on the business world's coverage of Kenneth's posthumous revenge. Margaret ran the estate with quiet efficiency, and slowly Rebecca began to understand that this was her life now, not temporary, not a dream that would evaporate, actual, tangible, permanent change. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, heavy with the promise of rain, Margaret appeared in the library where Rebecca was reviewing foundation proposals. There's a situation at the main gate, a woman demanding entry. Security has refused, but she's hysterical, screaming your name. Rebecca's stomach tightened. She pulled up the security camera feed on the tablet Margaret handed her. Kimberly stood outside the iron gates, soaked from drizzle that had started an hour ago. Her clothes were cheap and ill-fitting. Her hair was lank, her makeup smeared by rain, or tears, or both. The rental car behind her was dented and streaked with mud. She looked like someone whose world had ended, which wasn't far from the truth. Rebecca watched Kimberly pound on the gates, screaming words the camera couldn't quite capture. Security guards stood just inside, professional and unmoved. How did she find this place? Anonymous letter delivered 3 days ago. Kenneth's instructions to Jonathan. GPS, coordinates, and a note confirming the first wife's current residence. Kenneth had engineered even this, the final confrontation between the woman he'd abandoned and the woman who'd killed him, setting the stage for Rebecca to choose mercy or vengeance, with Kimberly desperate and broken before her. Autumn appeared at Rebecca's elbow, drawn by the commotion. "Mommy, who's that lady yelling?" Rebecca knelt, meeting her daughter's eyes. "Someone who hurt a lot of people. She's scared now because she's losing everything." "Are you going to help her?" The question was innocent, uncomplicated by adult understanding of justice and consequences. Autumn just saw someone suffering and asked if help was coming. I don't know yet, baby. It's complicated. What would Jesus do? Autumn had been attending Sunday services with Margaret, absorbing lessons that hadn't been part of Rebecca's own childhood. The question landed with unexpected weight. Jesus would probably forgive her. Then maybe we should too. Rebecca stood looking at the security monitor again. Kimberly had collapsed against the gate, her body shaking with sobs that looked genuine even through the camera's distance. Margaret, have security open the pedestrian gate. I'll meet her at the library entrance. Margaret's eyebrows rose fractionally, but she nodded and relayed instructions through her radio. Rebecca sent Autumn to stay with Edward, then walked through the house to the library's French doors that opened onto the terrace. She watched Kimberly trudge up the gravel drive, soaked and shivering, the walk of someone who'd given up any pretense of dignity. When Kimberly reached the terrace, Rebecca opened the door, gesturing her inside. Kimberly entered cautiously, dripping water onto hard wood floors worth more than her former monthly allowance. They stood facing each other in the library, two women connected by one man's choices and cruelties. Rebecca gestured to a chair near the fireplace where Margaret had lit a fire against the afternoon chill. "Sit down, Kimberly." Kimberly remained standing, her voice raw and desperate. "You knew. You who sat in that office, took that pathetic dollar, and you knew he'd set me up to take the fall for debts I didn't create." Rebecca settled into the opposite chair, in contrast to Kimberly's panic. "I knew nothing until the next morning. Kenneth engineered his revenge without my knowledge or consent. He ruined me." Kimberly's voice broke the words, dissolving into something between a scream and a sob. "I have nothing. The house is gone. The car's repossessed. My accounts are frozen. Richard won't answer my calls. I'm living in a motel room that charges by the week and smells like mold. I'm facing bankruptcy and federal fraud investigations, all because I married a vindictive old man who couldn't let go. All because you poisoned him." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Kimberly went pale, her body swaying slightly. "What did you say?" Rebecca pulled a single sheet from the folder Timothy had left, the chemical analysis report. She held it out, watching Kimberly's face as recognition dawned. "Kenneth knew what you were doing. He documented everything. The affair with Richard, the insider trading, the offshore accounts, the synthetic compounds you were putting in his scotch to accelerate his heart failure." Kimberly sank into the chair, her legs apparently no longer capable of holding her weight. She stared at the report, her lips moving silently. "He knew for 6 months. He knew you were killing him, knew about your plans with Richard, knew everything, and he chose not to stop you because his revenge required his death to activate." Kimberly looked up, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. "That's insane." "It's calculated. Kenneth built his entire empire on understanding leverage and timing. This was his final deal." Silence settled between them, broken only by the fire crackling and the sound of rain intensifying outside. Kimberly seemed to collapse inward, all her designer polish and confident cruelty stripped away to reveal something raw and broken. "Are you giving this to the police?" Rebecca held the chemical report, feeling the weight of choice in her hands. One phone call to federal prosecutors, and Kimberly would spend the rest of her life in prison. Justice, consequences, the law taking its course. But Rebecca had learned that revenge rarely satisfied the way people imagined. She'd spent 4 years angry at Kenneth, and that anger had accomplished nothing except make her smaller. Now she had power over Kimberly, power to destroy what Kenneth's financial traps hadn't already broken. and she found she didn't want it. "I'm not giving it to the police." Kimberly gasped, hope flickering in her eyes. But Rebecca raised a hand, cutting off whatever desperate gratitude was forming. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm done being part of Kenneth's toxic legacy. Prosecuting you means trials and media and months of reliving his death. I'm choosing peace over justice." She stood crossing to the desk and pulling out an envelope Jonathan had prepared at her request. "You're leaving the country tonight. Jonathan has arranged a one-way ticket to Canada departing at 10 p.m. This envelope contains $50,000 in cash, enough to start over if you're careful." Kimberly stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I don't understand. Why would you help me?" "I'm not helping you. I'm freeing myself. But there are conditions." Rebecca's voice hardened, taking on an edge that made Kimberly shrink back slightly. "You leave the United States tonight and never return. You never contact me, Richard, or anyone else connected to Kenneth's life. You never speak to media about this. If you violate any of these terms, every piece of evidence goes to the FBI immediately. The chemical analysis, the audio recordings of you and Richard planning Kenneth's death, all of it." She leaned forward, making sure Kimberly understood completely. "Jonathan has digital copies on encrypted servers with instructions to release everything if I send a single code word. You're getting mercy you don't deserve because my daughter asked me what Jesus would do. Don't make me regret listening to a 7-year-old's wisdom." Kimberly took the envelope with trembling hands, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to name. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Richard said it would be easy, said we'd just take some money and leave. I didn't understand what I was doing until it was too late. You understood enough to discuss dosages and timelines. You understood enough to plan Monaco. Don't rewrite history to make yourself feel better." Rebecca walked to the French doors, opening them despite the rain. "Jonathan is waiting at the front entrance. He'll drive you to the airport. If you miss that flight, the deal is void, and the evidence goes to prosecutors in the morning." Kimberly stood slowly clutching the envelope like a lifeline. She moved toward the door, then paused. "Why did Kenneth marry me if he loved you?" The question was small and lost the voice of someone trying to understand the wreckage of her choices. Because he was broken and scared and thought money could fix everything, but money just amplified what was already there. His fear, his cruelty, his inability to value what couldn't be measured in dollars. Rebecca watched Kimberly walk back into the rain, heading toward Jonathan's car, waiting in the circular drive. She stood at the French doors until the taillights disappeared down the driveway, then closed them and locked the estate against the weather and the past and everything that had come before. Autumn found her there, standing in the quiet library with the fire burning low. "Did you help the sad lady, Mommy?" Rebecca pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and innocence. "I helped us both, baby. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about not letting their hurt control you anymore." 6 months transformed everything. Edward's Parkinson's symptoms stabilized under expert care. His tremors managed his mind clear more days than not. Autumn thrived in private tutoring, her natural curiosity finding room to expand without the constraints of overcrowded classrooms. And Rebecca discovered that having money meant having power to change things beyond her own life. Autumn's Hope Foundation launched on a crisp October morning, occupying the west wing of Silvermere Estate. The mission was simple: provide single mothers with resources to escape poverty, legal aid for unfair divorces, job training, childcare, housing assistance, everything Rebecca had needed and couldn't find during her darkest years. The first client was Melissa Hartwell, Rebecca's co-worker from the bakery. Melissa had finally left an abusive marriage after years of threats and control, walking out with 2 children and nothing else. The foundation provided her with a lawyer who secured full custody, an apartment deposit, and job training for a career that paid enough to actually support her family. Rebecca stood in the foundation's main office, watching Melissa hug her children in the playroom, where trained staff watched over kids while their mothers attended workshops or legal consultations. The space was warm and welcoming, designed to feel safe rather than institutional. "You saved my life." Melissa's voice cracked with gratitude, but Rebecca shook her head. "We save each other. That's how this works. Sometimes the best way to heal from pain is to prevent others from experiencing it." Rebecca had turned Kenneth's guilt money into something that actually helped transforming his legacy from empire building to empire distribution. The foundation grew quickly, word spreading through networks of women who'd been invisible to systems designed around different kinds of need. By winter, they were helping 30 families. By spring, 50. Each one a story of survival of women choosing dignity over desperation of children, finally stable enough to just be children. Edward sat in on board meetings occasionally, offering business wisdom tempered by experience. Autumn helped in the playroom after her tutoring sessions, reading to younger children with the patient kindness of someone who remembered what uncertainty felt like. And Rebecca discovered that purpose felt better than revenge ever could. One evening in late April, she walked to the lake dock with Autumn, both of them carrying fishing poles they had no idea how to use. The swans had built a nest near the shore, and they could see eggs nestled in carefully arranged reeds. Autumn cast her line awkwardly, the lure plopping into the water without any technique or grace. "Mommy, do you think Grandfather Kenneth watches us from heaven?" Rebecca considered the question carefully, knowing Autumn deserved honesty more than comfort. "I think if there's a heaven, he probably sees what we're doing with the money he left. Whether he's happy about it or not, I can't say. Miss Margaret says he loved us but didn't know how to show it. That might be true. Some people are so broken that love comes out sideways, all twisted up with fear and anger and hurt." "Do you forgive him?" Rebecca reeled in her line, watching the lure emerge from the dark water. "I'm working on it, baby. Forgiveness isn't something you do once. It's something you choose over and over every time the anger tries to come back." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the lake in colors that looked invented. Autumn leaned against Rebecca's shoulder, solid and trusting, and alive in ways Kenneth had never allowed himself to be. They say living well is the best revenge, but is forgiving someone who wronged you weakness or the ultimate strength? Rebecca had chosen mercy over prosecution, peace over justice, building over destroying. She'd let Kimberly go rather than watch her burn. She'd transformed Kenneth's empire into something that actually helped rather than just accumulated. Some would call that weakness. Kimberly had murdered Kenneth, and Rebecca had let her walk away with $50,000 and a plane ticket. But revenge wouldn't have brought Kenneth back, wouldn't have erased the 4 years of poverty, wouldn't have made Autumn's childhood any easier. It would have just added more pain to a world already drowning in it. Rebecca had chosen differently, and now sitting on a dock on property she owned with her daughter beside her, and swans building nests, and a foundation helping women survive. What she'd survived, she felt something she'd thought Kenneth had taken from her. Freedom. Real freedom, not the kind bought with money, though money certainly helped, but the freedom that came from refusing to let anyone else's cruelty define her worth. The fishing poles caught nothing, but that wasn't really the point. They stayed until the stars emerged, then walked back to the house together, Autumn chattering about the day's adventures, while Rebecca listened and remembered when silence had been all she could afford. Inside, Edward was reading in the library, his trembling hands managing pages with practiced patience. Margaret was preparing dinner, humming something classical. The foundation wing was dark and quiet until tomorrow's clients arrived with their children and their hope and their exhaustion. This was Rebecca's inheritance, not the money, though, that helped, not the estate, though it was beautiful, but the chance to transform pain into purpose, to survive something, and then use that survival to help others do the same. Kenneth had left her $1 to prove she was worthless. Instead, it had proved she was priceless. That $1 had bought freedom she couldn't have purchased any other way, taught her lessons she couldn't have learned except through their strange, terrible journey. Some inheritances are measured in dollars, others are measured in freedom. Rebecca had gotten both, and discovered that the second mattered infinitely more than the first. She tucked Autumn into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood in the doorway, watching her daughter breathe. Tomorrow would bring new clients to the foundation, new stories of survival and struggle. It would bring board meetings and legal documents and the endless work of managing wealth designed to help rather than hoard. But tonight there was just this, her daughter, safe and warm, her father cared for her own heart, finally at peace with the past. Kenneth was gone. Kimberly was exiled. Richard's company had collapsed under the weight of federal investigations into his business practices, and Rebecca was here building something that would outlast all of them.